Okay, it's time, and I think we are quorate, so we can begin. And welcome to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and welcome to the 22nd annual Pumphandle lecture of the John Snow Society. My name is Paul Fine. I'm just going to say a word or two about the society before introducing our speaker. The society continues to flourish. We're now over 3,000 members. So all of us as epidemiologists recognize the issues involved in having a society with lifetime membership, and people don't inform us when they pass on. A few calculations, like we know prevalence equals incidence times duration, and our incidence is about 200 a year, and give an average age of 30-ish, maybe an average duration of 45-ish. That tells us our stable prevalence will be something like 9,000 in the years to come. But our demographers want to put age and sex-specific rates in there, and you can get any number from 6 to 20,000. I don't know. Anyway, we're healthy. And given that epidemiologists love meetings, and the fact that we have the statutory rule of any time two members meet, it's a meeting of the society. We continue to have more meetings than I think any other society. Maybe more than all other societies put together. That's an interesting calculation for somebody in the future. But this is our big meeting, of course, our big annual meeting, the Pumphandle lecture, celebrating the anniversary. It's 160 years since last Monday, since the most famous gesture, I guess, in the history of public health, the removal of the pump handle in Soho, in a site where I hope I will see all of you later this evening. I should just briefly acknowledge a lot of people who have kept the society running, in particular Ros Stanwell Smith, our honorary secretary, and people at the Royal Society for Public Health who do much of the admin of the organization. We're very grateful for them. And I should mention that, well, it's now 22 years from what started as sort of a lark, when a few people banded together to correct a misinterpretation by the new owner of the pub, who thought that John Snow was a fast-bowling cricketer and threw away the original guest books donated by people from this school. We corrected that misinterpretation. And the society looks like a stayer, and so we've devoted a good deal of attention in recent months to making sure the society remains sustainable for the future, which we are all pleased about. And thus the initials PHLS will continue to live on as the Pumphandle lecture series. Enough of that. Should introduce tonight's speaker, who's an exemplar of the John Snow tradition. Jeremy Farrar has lived and worked in many places, originally from Singapore and places, then up the street, University College, medicine, immunology, then Oxford, DPhil, myasthenia gravis, then back to Southeast Asia, 20 years, where he became director of the Oxford Clinical Research Unit in Vietnam. And he returned just almost exactly a year ago to become director of the Wellcome Trust, a hugely important job, as every person in this room appreciates. He's passionate about research. He's contributed a great deal to a number of subjects, in particular infectious diseases, dengue, malaria, tuberculosis. He was on the front line in the SARS in 2003 and with avian influenza. He's received many awards, including an OBE in 2005 and the Ho Chi Minh Medal of Vietnam. He's a special person. He's also started a foundation, the Farrar Foundation, which supports young people from Southeast Asia in achieving their potential. He's a very special person. Enough from me. It gives me great pleasure, and I think everybody here great pleasure and privilege to welcome Jeremy to give his 22nd annual Pumphandle, perhaps the most widely advertised lecture in the world from what you saw on medicine and public health. Are divorced too long? And there's no question mark after it. It's as a statement, not a question. So he will speak to that. Jeremy, welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a great privilege, of course, to be here. Just on that very last point, one of the last things Mark Wolpert said to me when he left the Trust was, you don't have to leave a question mark at the end of a statement when you direct the Trust, you can just make a statement. So thank you very much. It's the first, this is not a complaint, of course, at all, but one of the things that Paul did forget to mention was that I have been for some time an honorary member of the London School and Hygiene Tropical Medicine faculty. But in the decade that has passed, this is the first time I've ever been invited to the school to give a lecture. And after this lecture, there may be very good reasons for that. So, huge privilege to be here. Paul introduced me, he said it's a whole pile of epidemiologists and public school, London school types. And I should just say at the start, I am not an epidemiologist. I didn't understand Paul's first statement about prevalence and incidence and some ratio, but I did catch that the end result was somewhere between 6 and 20,000, which seems the sort of confidence intervals you usually seem to quote. Or is that imperial? I never know. So, conflicts of interest. I'm not yet a member of this society, but I gather that later on tonight I'll be inducted with a funny handshake and do something with my trousers to show that I am a member, and I am director of the Wellcome Trust as of not yet a year, 10 months. So John Snow, he was a fantastic fast bowler for England. I grew up watching him, aggressive, unpleasant, and took many wickets. So although John Snow should not be confused, the anaesthetists own him. The epidemiologists apparently own him, and I think actually in that there's something very important that we forget in 2014, and that is that he was a polymath. He not only gave anaesthetics for the first time and delivered babies for the Queen, but he did this mapping stuff and a lot of other things to begin in between that. And I just worry, and this is very important for a school like this, that if we go down ever more increasing silos of separation of stuff, then we won't be able to put together the sorts of things that John Snow actually led all those 160 years ago or so. And that will be a theme that I go through this talk. And the other theme will be that I don't believe that in the typhoid epidemic of Soho that started on the 1st of September, and finished 6 weeks later, please remember that time, that John Snow would have approached it in quite the same way today as he did then. But I think a lot of those sorts of epidemics are approached in the same way, and I think there's a gap to be filled there. The other thing, of course, as in John Snow's own words, were that the epidemic was coming to an end before he took the pump handle off. I hate to disillusion many people in the society, but that does seem to be staged in his own words. And it resulted because many people fled the area. Many people ran away from Soho, just as they might be running away in West Africa today. And I think there's also some lessons there. So a little bit more background. This was me a few years ago on the right. I was, as you heard, born in Southeast Asia and lived in many places. Aden, Libya for 7 years, emigrated to New Zealand, but sorry for the New Zealanders, after 6 months decided it was too far away and all came back, the youngest of 6 children. Yes, I trained just up the road at University College London, and then a PhD in immunology in Oxford, and then having decided, trained in neurology I should say, and having decided in a talk actually very similar to this, it was in Norwich in 1995, and looking up at a group of neurologists in 1995, decided halfway through the talk, who knows what may happen halfway through this talk, decided that I couldn't stand the thought of working with that group of neurologists for the rest of my life. And if I pause halfway through here, please stop me. And by absolute coincidence, I was back to Oxford the next day, And somebody in the malaria group who was working in the lab next to where I was working said that there might be something coming up in Vietnam. And anyway, the long and the short of it was 18 years later, I was still there and enjoyed a fantastic time. And before I start, just perhaps thank everybody who is on this slide, and many, many more, whose work I shared over the last 18 years. Some of the people in the pictures you will undoubtedly recognise. But for some reason, which I still sometimes question occasionally, although I notice there's one or two governors in the room, so I should be a little bit careful here, I gave up the view from my office over there for a commute, courtesy of Great Western Railways and British Rail, every day to the Euston Road. And that has been a major transition, as you can imagine, from clinical practice, Vietnam, to a daily commute from Oxford. 10 months ago, it's not yet a year. But this is what I did before I left. I very much am from the clinical end of clinical science. I did two ward rounds every day in my whole time in Vietnam, and this is the sort of spectrum of diseases we saw. I think it's one of the, if not the largest infectious disease hospitals in the world, about 550 or 700 beds depending on what the demand is. And this was the range of infections we saw. And importantly, and again I'll come back to this, the number one was we had no idea what was going on. But coming from my neurology days, and coming particularly to talk to this sort of audience, it's clear globally that the world is changing. And David used to look like the person on my right, and he now looks like the person on my left. In clinical terms, in whatever specialty you talk about, there's a group of individuals, about 50% of the population, who occasionally do get pregnant and are never included in almost any clinical study ever conducted, despite the fact that they actually suffer from many diseases. So infectious diseases, and the population is growing older, as we all know, and diabetes and non-communicable diseases are becoming more common. And that has implications for all of the infectious diseases. So the idea that in the future, global health, tropical medicine, London School of Hygiene and tropical medicine will deal solely with one of those aspects is nonsense. And we're going to have to again learn how to break down the silos of cardiology, of diabetes, of neurology, and of infectious diseases itself, of epidemiology, of clinical. And if there was one institution in the world that might be able to do that, it's here. And I think that gives you a great opportunity, but also a great responsibility, because we mustn't allow ourselves to become ever more siloed. When more than two people are gathered together, apparently it's a John Snow meeting. The other thing that it does at the moment is when more than two people gather together, they must mention the word Ebola, and I will come back to it later. And I'm actually going to talk now for much of the rest of the talk about emerging infections. Not because I think in themselves emerging infections are as important. I don't like the idea that we have a Premier League of things which you have to ever put your disease higher up that league table so that you can get yet another Wellcome Trust grant, because TB kills more people than malaria kills more people, and HIV kills more people, the rest of it. But I think emerging infections have a particular issue which actually goes across all of the other aspects of clinical and epidemiology, and that is that we've got ourselves into a position where actually doing the critical research that's necessary has become so complicated that we're not able to do it, and we're not able to do it in the time frames that we've got available. So contagion, I don't know how many of you have seen it. If you think the science in it was rubbish, I'm sorry. Made a very, very small contribution to the way. I actually thought it was quite good, and of course the bottom picture at the end is what's happening today in West Africa. This is a very old slide now, I apologise for that, it's 10 years old, but the concept behind it was actually very important, and that was to try to map the emerging areas where health issues might emerge. And for the first time ever, emerging infectious diseases, zoonotic infections, were classified and included critically, in my view, the world's most important emerging infection, and that's drug resistance. And for the first time, these were put into the same group. One of the reasons I was so happy, despite notwithstanding the office view in Vietnam, was also because Vietnam is one of an epicentre. It's not the only one, and I appreciate this is a biased view towards Asia. But within that red circle, if you flew for 4 hours, you flew over about 60% of the world's population of humans and about 75% of the world's chickens. And one of the things about Asia is that that combination of people and chickens and everything else living together is a breeding ground for the emergence of zoonotic infections. The other thing that's changed, of course, over the years, and I was this affected my life. When I first came to the UK, I got on a boat in Singapore, and I came to the UK and I arrived 8 weeks later, going through the Suez Canal and arriving in Southampton. In that course of that 8 weeks, if I'd had a terrible lurgy, I'd have either got over it or I'd have died. Now, of course, that time has shortened much. This is air traffic in 1933, this is air traffic in 2010, and this actually is air traffic, it doesn't matter, in Southeast Asia. The world is ever more connected, and so what happens actually in West Africa today is important in London tomorrow. What happens in Jakarta yesterday is going to be important in New York. And one of the big transitions that's going to occur in this air traffic is, yes, of course, Sub-Saharan Africa to Europe. That's going to continue to happen. But the growth there is going to be Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. The air travel and movement of freight and people between those two continents will have a massive impact on the way infections travel around the world, mosquitoes travel around the world, and it won't be north-south anymore, it will be south and east. And that transition is going on at a rate of about increased fourfold every 3 or 4 years. And these emerging infections are not that rare, although of course they only become part of Western consciousness when somebody might be transferred to the Royal Free, or somebody gets off, goes to Atlanta and everybody starts to hear about it. But the reality is, around the world, in regional epidemics, occasionally spilling beyond epidemics, there are all the time these small emerging infectious diseases going on. So just this year, and in fact only in the first 3 or 4 months of this year, each of these have played major impacts on the regions where they have been going on. So MERS-CoV in the Middle East, new influenza strain in China. There's been a massive outbreak of hand, foot and mouth disease in Southeast Asia caused by enterovirus 71. Tens of thousands of individuals in Ho Chi Minh City, Jakarta, southern China, Bangkok, and the rest of Southeast Asia coming in. If you imagine that sort of epidemic in central London and the impact on the NHS of suddenly having 10,000 individuals coming in over the space of 2 to 3 months under the age of 5, it would be a profound impact. And it's no different in those countries. So it's not just the impact of the actual emergence, it's the secondary impacts on the broader health issues, and that is also true, of course, of Ebola, and I'll come back to that. So travel is, of course, important. Environmental change, land use change is driving changes in the way mosquitoes move, and of course that Southeast Asia, China link to Sub-Saharan Africa is changing the way mosquitoes move around the world, because they often get taken in ships and airplanes between continents. Counterfeit drugs are having a massive impact on both treatment of individuals, but also on the possibilities of the emergence of drug resistance, zoonotic illnesses. And perhaps one of the greatest drivers, I think, of these has been urbanization that's going on across all of the so-called tropical, so-called lower middle income countries, with increasing numbers of people, of course, now living in massive urban centres. So these emerging infections have a timeline to them, which, if you look in a single place, have actually been remarkably consistent. So if you go back to John Snow's work in Soho 160 or so years ago, 1st of September was when it started. It's a very important day because it's my birthday. It ended, or at least the curve came down, about 41 days later. That was the epidemic curve from the 1st of September. If you look at what happened in 1918 in those 4 cities, Berlin, New York, London and Paris, I may say a few things wrong now, please don't criticise me for the epidemiological map I'm going to draw here, but the increase in mortality, the upstroke to its peak and the downstroke in one centre, and the days of the month are along the bottom, that's 6 weeks. If you look in Mexico in 2009 at the start of the pandemic, in a single square kilometre in central Mexico, it was 6 weeks. Of course, there are secondary waves, but you have 6 weeks in many of these epidemics in which, if you're going to act in order to prevent subsequent spread, your chance to learn the maximum is in that 6 weeks. And it may well be that you'll not learn it, and you actually may even learn some wrong lessons, and actually this was one of the problems in Mexico. You'll actually learn it from communities that, apart from John Snow, rarely talk to each other. Because if you look at any of the previous infections, whether it be MERS-CoV, influenza H1N1 2009, or SARS, or bird flu, or actually Ebola, the first people to pick those up were not, I hate to say it, public health experts. They were actually people in intensive care units, because they saw a tip of an iceberg of something odd going on. And traditionally, apart from John Snow of course, the link between anaesthetics and intensive care as a, if you like, canary to see when something bad is happening, that link has not been forged as well as it could have been. And I think there is some work to be done there around the way early things could be picked up. So overall, bearing in mind that this talk is being recorded and therefore one does have to be a little bit careful about what one says, I think on the whole a lot of communities post-SARS, and that for me is when this response to emerging infections changed, I think a lot of those communities have actually got a lot better. China was in a terrible state in 2003, 2004 around SARS, but actually in the 10 years subsequently it's done a fantastic job, and you can see what happened with H7N9 to sort of appreciate that. So surveillance is now much better than it's ever been, and we're much better at picking things up. What we haven't done is worked out anything about what we do when we pick things up. Epidemiology, modelling, public health, policy, virology, sharing of information, even development of vaccines, I think, in some degree. International cooperation, although I would exempt MERS-CoV, which I don't think has been good. And even the media and the public, I think, on the whole, with the exception when a couple of Americans land back in Atlanta, on the whole, the media and the public have reacted very responsibly to emerging infections. The one community that I think has failed to step up has been my community, and I've been involved in many of these, so I take sort of semi-personal responsibility. The clinical research community has failed to respond to the challenge of new emerging events. We have observed, but what have we truly learnt about how to either treat an individual to save a life, to prevent secondary transmission? Have we learnt in all of the surveillance that is now possible, so that you will hear about an H7N9 in China, you will hear about Ebola in West Africa, you will hear about MERS in CoV in the Middle East, because we have better surveillance today. But have we truly been able to say what we will do when we pick all of those things up? And how are we going to deal with the fact that we're going to see this now on a regular basis? And if we're going to try and avoid somehow the boy that cried wolf, how are we going to ensure that we respond well to what needs to be responded to, and we're not responding too much when we don't need to respond? And I think we have not worked out how to do that. So, pandemic influenza, 16% of this audience during 2009 were exposed to H1N1. 16% of the world's population saw the virus. How many patients in the first wave were randomised to any clinical trial to work out how to treat? 0. So if you ask the question, and I think if you ask the question for any of the infections that are on there, SARS, hemolytic uremic syndrome in Germany, H5N1, Nipah virus, which is still circulating in Bangladesh, H7N9, artemisinin-resistant malaria, because I think that's in this same group, Ebola and MERS-CoV, and ask yourself, for any of those, do we know who to treat, with which drug, for how long, at what doses, or who not to treat? Do we know anything about the pharmacology of the PK-PD interaction? That's a sort of pharmacological long word for equivalent to your incidence and prevalence. It's a very complicated thing. But it is critical to understand that if you want to understand how to treat an individual, and we haven't worked any of that out. We've no idea about the role of interventions. There's still arguments today about the role of oseltamivir, or influenza vaccines, dare I say it, in secondary transmission control. Wearing of masks, hand washing, gloves, which of these do we actually know make any difference, or which makes things worse? We don't know how to prevent resistance developing, and if it did develop, we don't know how to treat it. And we don't know, when it comes to the more sort of clinical intensive care end, we don't know which of the drugs, which of the bundles that are used in intensive care, which of them work, and which, if you only could do 3 of them in Sierra Leone tomorrow, which 3 would you do out of 15? We can't answer that for a single one, in my view, of those infections, such that there was a systematic review done, wonderful meta-analysis done, up until the end of 2013, over 100 studies, actually it's closer to 150. This is WHO now. Overall, the quality of the body of the evidence was very low to low, leading to global WHO recommendations, which I quote, strong recommendation, very low quality evidence. Who knows what that means? Do I treat? Do I not treat? Do I do it? Do I don't do it? Do I do more of it, or do I do less of it? Even though 16% of the world's population had that infection, at the end of it, 3 years on, and bearing in mind in the United Kingdom in 2010 the epidemic was worse than 2009, we have no idea, I believe, to answer any of those questions. So the Department of Health, some of whom are here today, are being severely criticised for stockpiling oseltamivir. Was it the right thing to do, or was it not the right thing to do? Nobody knows. Leading to a headline after a British medical journal that oseltamivir does not work. Is that true? No idea. No idea. And I think part of the reason for that is that certainly in my career, we have made human subject research globally so complicated and so difficult that actually I believe it to be currently unethical in what we do. This is the time frame. Patient, it doesn't matter, it could be a community, it doesn't have to be clinical, it could be a community. Day one, a bright clinician, this is Professor Trantin here with the white hat on in the middle, looks a bit older now. Day one, he has a bright idea about what might happen to that community or that individual patient. In the old days, and I'm not saying this was good, he might go away and write a 2 or 3 page protocol. The protocol now looks like there at the top on the left. He then goes to a series of teleconferences, and I have to say, and this is a particular issue I think living in Asia, teleconferences with the rest of the world are always at 11 o'clock at night, because you lot in the UK and in North America can never have it any other time because they have to suit Seattle and all sorts of other places. So you're always up in the middle of the night for teleconferences. I don't know if any of you have seen the YouTube video of a teleconference, but it is one of the funniest videos on YouTube and everybody should watch it. You never get anything out of any teleconference that I've ever been on. I haven't got a pointer, I'm sorry. You then go to, and I think a few years ago I would have blamed the middle group, the institutional review boards, the ethical committees. Actually, I have to say that over time they have dramatically improved, and I don't think that group of faceless people who've never been in a patient or a community that I portrayed 5 years ago is true today. I think they have actually stepped up and have got much better. I don't think that's where the major problem is. Anyway, you go back to the teleconference, poor Trantin here and goes back to his office and that protocol. Finally, and this is the average in the UK and in the United States, sorry, in the whole of the European Union and in the United States, it is 611 days from idea to first individual. 611 days is 14 Jon Snow epidemics in 611 days, roughly. That's not absolute. So it takes you 611 days to get back to your patient and get that individual, if they want to be consented, to join that study, whatever that study might be. If you, are a patient, that's too long. If you're a young epidemiologist, young clinician, why on earth would you spend the next 611 days of your career doing that, when actually, dare I say it, the exciting bit, which is the study itself and the subsequent, is way down the track, and the great and good on the front row here would take all the glory, because they'll probably still be in position, but you'll have long gone into the rest of your career. And the papers will come out, and you might be lucky if you get 4th author and the rest of it, and of course you'll never get a Wellcome Trust grant if you're 4th author. So what chance have you got? Why on earth, sorry, that was the old Wellcome Trust, the trust has changed. Why on earth would you go into this field? It's too complicated, it's putting off too many young people, and if we don't do something about this, no sensible person will go into this style of work, whether it's your sort of epidemiology or my sort of clinical. We have to do something, and there have been, to be fair, there have been some movements on that. It's a little bit shorter now. It's 609.5 days. This was actually a very good report. It must be the most boring title for a report ever written, but it actually, if you haven't read it, it really is worth having a look at. It was actually a review of human subject research published actually a few years ago now, and I think some of the statements in it are actually very important. Complex regulation means we are not delivering vital health research for our patients. Urgent changes are needed because of unnecessary bureaucracy and complexity are stifling medical advances without additional benefits to patient safety, and the current system is making it increasingly difficult to initiate health research and prevent patients from participating in studies. It has improved, there's no doubt, it has changed a little bit, but by no means enough. And it's a particular problem within emerging infections. So I do believe we need to drive this, because the regulators and the legal systems won't change this. It will be us that change this. I think it does need a new paradigm. I think the emerging infections, I think it's important to push it through that, but I think actually it's much broader than emerging infections. I just think we can, if you like, piggyback on the back of emerging infections and just demonstrate how stupid this is on the basis of those. And my hope is that actually there'll be benefits very, very much more broadly. I think we do have to get much more innovative, and this comes again back to the role that the London School needs to play. We have to get more innovative than A versus B after 611 days in and get a result 5 years later. We have to become more innovative in the design of studies. I believe we have to move almost in a sense, although I hate the analogy, almost in a sense to a much more military style, where you actually prepare for things that are happening and you actually have things in place. There aren't so many parts of the body that can go wrong in emerging infection. It's either going to be your brain or your respiratory system, or it's going to be a viral. You know, you could probably have 6 or 8 which would actually allow you to go very quickly. And you're not talking in those early days of complex, unsafe, dangerous things. You're talking about some fairly simple gathering of data, which just is not going on. MERS-CoV is almost exactly 2 years to the first patient really being identified here in London, which stimulated the whole thing. And we have done none of this. We don't know how much transmission is going on. We don't know the seroprevalence in the Middle East. We don't really know how humans catch it. We certainly don't know how to treat a patient. We don't have a vaccine. We've not made any real progress. And we're lucky because MERS-CoV has not really changed, and it looks to be unlikely to change. But that's mostly luck. And I think all of this, we talk about open access, but I think open access is not just about open access to data, it's open access to the whole process of research. And I think we have to get much earlier in when we start sharing that information. Of course, that has implications for all of us. And the other factor that comes up is we need to learn to have a bit of a thick skin. There's no evidence for this. I'm just going to make a personal statement without a question mark at the end of it because I'm Director of the Wellcome Trust. I believe that the current response to Ebola has been affected by the criticisms that were made at the time of pandemic flu. I believe that we were all being too slow because we were worried, including WHO, of being said that we were exaggerating the response again. And it goes back to my point about surveillance and how we're going to learn to deal with the plethora of different things which emerge, and how are we going to learn to be relevant to the outbreak without either exaggerating its or underestimating. And I think with Ebola currently, we've underestimated it. These are the scenes, I assume people here in the audience may have witnessed this. Whatever I think we've read about Ebola and the people here in the audience who have been there recently, and it would be good to hear from them, the situation, I believe, is worse than even you're hearing in the newspapers. There is a danger, and I think there's 3 issues here. There's Ebola, and we're allowing this virus, which is a zoonotic virus, to get infecting in a very large number of human beings. The viral load in these individuals in this outbreak is way higher than in any previous outbreak. And we're allowing this virus the potential to adapt to a human population, and one shouldn't get melodramatic, the potential for this changing from an epidemic to an endemic infection. The numbers are far, far greater than it's not underreporting, it's just the fact that the chaotic system, and maybe Dilys wants to comment on that. So going back to Peter's brilliant work in 1976, this outbreak represents all of the other outbreaks added together, and it's much bigger. Very much bigger. It's bigger in terms of size, numbers, in terms of deaths, in terms of geographic spread. Imagine trying to control an epidemic which has this sort of geographical spread now across multiple countries, trans-borders, movement of people in countries recently come out of civil war. And if I had a criticism of the public health response, it has been, I think, we've been too slow to say we can control this with our current systems. I believe this epidemic has got to the point, and actually got to the point many months ago, when our classic methods of control are just not going to work, and we should have been earlier to recognise that fact. And I think there may be many reasons we can discuss why that's happened. I think there are issues both about the virus. Clearly this virus does look different. It is mutating. I think it is probably adapting. and it's clearly getting you viral loads much higher than previously. So some biological reasons. But I think the much more important reasons, and I apologise for this slide, it's lent to me from Simon Hay, and there's too much information on it. But the key messages are the world has changed since 1976. These are no longer rural outbreaks with populations that can be in some way corralled. And Peter might want to comment on this, I believe rural communities are different to urban communities. I think in the way they interact with each other, the number of contacts they have. In 1976 and the early 1980s, the average contact per case of Ebola was 9 to 12, so varied between 9 and 12. It's now between 120 and 140 in urban settings. So if you apply the same quarantine and contact tracing that you applied in 1976, the human resources required to contact all of those individuals, now 120 per single case, clearly overwhelms the system, and it's not possible. So I think we were too slow to rethink that response, and as a result, and sorry, the other thing is, of course, urban populations move more, they migrate more, they fly more, and if they don't fly more, they get on buses, and like Jon Snow's people in Soho, they flee. If you were faced with these sorts of sites of people in spacesuits, not even called treatment centres, called something else, and given no prospect of coming into them to do anything other than be buried nicely away from your family, I just don't think you would probably put up with that. You would run away, and that of course has led to that. So I think we have to change the paradigm around which we deal with these, and I do think, whether it be therapeutics, diagnostics, understanding of society and communication strategies, and the context of society that this is going in, I do think we have to change our approach. The Ebola has its own biological features. It has massive secondary consequences for health. In the rainy season in West Africa, the number of deaths from malaria this year will be very much higher than normal. Women in childbirth have no clinics, functioning clinics, in these 3 countries currently, so that will increase the burden. And finally, in countries who have just come out of civil war, I think there's a very real prospect of civic society breaking down completely. So that is the scenario I think we're in, and that's quite an optimistic scenario. So I do think the emerging infections, they're not up there in terms of deaths, they're not up there in terms of DALYs, they're not up there with the big 3, and most of my work over the last 20 years has been in TB and malaria and opportunistic infections related to HIV. But I think emerging infectious diseases challenges in ways that those others don't, and I think there's some new thinking to be done in that space. Not only that, but also we're going to have to put those infectious diseases in the context of the new rise of non-communicable diseases. Ebola in somebody who is 70 or 75 looks different. It is different to somebody that's 18, the traditional sufferers from Ebola. A pregnant woman with Ebola is going to respond differently, and an obese individual is going to be different in terms of their viral load, in terms of any treatment. So I think we need to change the way we're thinking about this. I also believe, and this is obviously the more controversial, and this is not the time for this discussion. I think history will be the time, and when we look back at this epidemic, but I think we have to ask whether those structures that we put in place in 1947, 1948, whether they be the United Nations, whether they be the World Health Organization, whether they actually be something I don't know anything about, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, whether those sorts of organizations put together, as you can see, when Yugoslavia existed, and mostly men in smoke-filled rooms, whether those sorts of structures in, let's say, the WHO, 30 to 50% reduction in funding over the last 3 to 4 years, are really capable of responding to those challenges and all of the other challenges global health faces. And there's a challenge to all of us, including the London School. I don't know the figures for this. My bet is if you went back at the London School 20 to 30 years ago and you looked how many of the London School faculty had been in WHO to work for any particular length of time or were regularly in it, my guess, and I don't know this, is that it's less today than it was. And the draw is to places like the Wellcome Trust, to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and to others. And I worry that the WHO is all of us, and actually when we criticise it, as you do, and I've done very much, we actually need to appreciate this is us. And if we want, as I believe we do, a global body responsible for health, I think it's critical. We cannot leave this to individual countries. then we're going to have to work out a different way of working. And actually, I'd like to see us rebuild those relationships with the WHO. Critical friend, reform is essential, but this is the view, obviously, from Geneva. It looks pretty clear. I think we've made it a little bit more complicated than that by all sorts of other agencies to which we all belong and contribute to. But as a result, the clarity that I think the WHO had a few years ago is now confused because all of these groups are working in effectively competing ways with that organisation. And I think as a result, we're not getting any coordination, any leadership, and I think that's absolutely critical. So John Snow, clearly a brilliant epidemiologist, sad that he removed the pump by the time the epidemic was already coming down, but that's the nature of epidemiology. I'm sure John Snow, given that he was an anaesthetist, if he'd been alive today, would have thought about drugs, would have thought about vaccines, not because they should replace the public health response, but in a way to make us think that they can complement a public health response. And instead of seeing ourselves as an epidemiologist or as a clinician, to see ourselves and make sure that as we train individuals, we allow those communities to interact in a better way than I believe we've done in the last 20 years. It would be unthinkable for somebody to go through their training in neurology today, stand up before an audience in Norwich and decide he was actually or she was going to go into infectious diseases. You couldn't do that in the medical training scheme today. And I think that cross-fertilisation from different specialties so that you can share the same coffee rooms, you can share the same languages, that must help in the end. And I worry that we're ever getting more siloed. And where I think this becomes very important is when we're faced with emerging infections, where the epidemiology community, the clinical community are not talking as much and they're talking different languages. And often you get a sense that one thinks the answer lies purely in vaccines and drugs, the other thinks the answer lies purely in public health measures, and then there's a third group of social scientists that think it answers purely in communication and anthropology, and of course none of those are right. Until we bring these together, I think we are always going to face this. So I think the public health of the future is going to be, some people have to be able to bridge this, and I think training institutions like this one have to be able to encourage, and funding agencies have to facilitate and allow people to be cross-disciplinary. So that in future, public health is not seen as a separate thing to medicine, as a separate thing to social sciences, but we try to bring them together. And public health people in the future will have to understand both infections and non-infections. They'll have to understand a little bit about genomics, as will clinicians and people from the medical field. So, my father was an English teacher, and I had this rammed down my throat as a kid, and I hated it at the time, but actually I've come to quite appreciate it. I do think that in some small way we're at a juncture where there is a tide in the affairs of man which I think we have to grasp. There is a tide in the affairs of man which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted all the voyages of our life, is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea we are now afloat, and we must take the current where it serves or lose our ventures. There is an opportunity driven by the fears of things like emerging infections, which is why we can jump on the bandwagon and help it use for our own purposes. And places like the London School and indeed the John Snow Society have a role to play in trying to bridge this gap and seizing this opportunity. Of course, those of you who are scholars of Shakespeare will appreciate what happened to the individual that said these words. It didn't work out so well for him, but nevertheless, I can be forgiven for that. And with that, I'll go back to Vietnam. Thank you very much indeed. I hope that was of some interest. Thank you. I spent last week with the regulators, and I wouldn't want this slide shown, and it's a terrible thing to do, but there has to be some humour somewhere along the line. I'll leave that one with you. This was after talking to the FDA. I'll take it off the screen very quickly. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Jeremy. Jeremy has agreed to answer some questions for a few minutes. The floor is... I see an eager hand.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I just want to put a shout out to UCSF while you're up there for a bit. But my question is about the IRB. So you mentioned the IRB is much too complicated. But right now, with let's say that we simplify the IRB process so that it takes 4 days. from submission to first patient enrolled. How would that help the current outbreak of Ebola when it's clear to me, I don't know about other people who have friends on the ground or what, that it's really a coordination issue, that there's no resources, there's no capacity in those areas to deal with this at all. And so even if we could bypass the IRB and get those patients enrolled and really put these vaccines on the ground and see if they work, how would it help that coordination issue or the communication issue?
Well, firstly, I think in my view now, the IRBs are actually not the problem. As I mentioned, they have changed in the last few years, and in fact, 72 hours was the time frame 2 weeks ago to get an Ebola study through an IRB. That is not the problem now. And nothing I say on the clinical side, whether they be drugs or vaccines or anything else, absolutely deflects from the absolutely critical nature of capacity building and public health measures. So these are not and should not be seen as separate entities. All I'm saying is in an infectious disease, on the whole, and there are obvious examples where this does not work, if you treat the infection, it's probably a good thing. It either saves the patient's life, it reduces the viral burden and so prevents secondary transmission, or it prevents individuals getting infected, particularly healthcare workers, and 70% of the sufferers in this outbreak have been women, because women are mostly carers in society, whether it be burials or whatever. So I think this should not be seen as separate to the public health intervention. It should be complementary to that intervention. And if it worked, there would be an absolute need. In 40 years, since Peter was first in Zaire to demonstrate this, ask yourself what progress we've been made in either of those two things, drugs or vaccines, or changing our approach to an epidemic. So I think just seeing it in the context of there's only one approach, there's no single answer, but being siloed in this and not asking whether those other interventions couldn't complement what's going on, I think we will always be in this position with Ebola unless we do it. And the only time to do that is during an epidemic, because there are no other cases of Ebola at other times. So the only time you can do it is during an epidemic. Challenging as that may be, it has to be done, I think.
Sandy?
One approach we've tried with cholera, following in John Snow's footsteps, is to get a generic proposal approved for funding and ethically agreed, so that we're sort of on the runway with the engines running when the outbreak occurred.
Did that work in Haiti?
We haven't got the funding yet.
All right. I absolutely agree with you, and actually it goes back to my point. It's overly simplistic, but actually, if we all sat down, there aren't hundreds of things we might have to prepare for. Whether it's capacity building, whether it's drugs, whether it's vaccines, whether it's public health, there aren't hundreds of things. And I think more generic protocols that would allow you, yes, whether it was cholera in Haiti, or actually, John Edmonds, I don't know if John's here, but we were both involved in a typhoid epidemic in Fiji. I mean, John was very keen to be involved in that epidemic. It hasn't made any difference. The epidemic's now disappeared. That was 2 years ago. We have not implemented any of these, and I agree. Generic protocols, which IRBs have pre-approved and already looked at, I think is the only way to go.
Might just say John has apologized. He's on a conference call with MSF about Ebola at this moment. There were several people.
Yes, I'm a social scientist. I've worked in leprosy for the last 20 years. I've always been a great advocate for bringing social science and medical science together so we have better understanding of how diseases affect people in communities. Do you have a comment on the role of the corporate sector?
Yeah.
One of the things that I see happening is when you have an emerging neglected tropical disease or possibly a re-emerging tropical disease, the tendency seems to be that the research funding goes up when that emergence is threatening us in our backyard. And how do we get big pharma, for example, to recognise that it's a threat to everybody, not just something which should be funded by here?
Yeah, it's obviously a very good question, and there's been a lot of stuff in the newspapers, particularly over the last few weeks. I'm sure you've looked at, complaining again that Big Pharma's not stepping up to the plate. I think we have to understand what Big Pharma's there for. It is there to make a profit, and we either accept that or we don't. And I think we're not going to change that. So I think what we need to do, and in these particular circumstances, and talking to begin with just around Big Pharma, I think we've got to work to a mechanism by which, for a certain number of things, which are absolutely critical, they may be cholera vaccines, they may be a vaccine for Ebola or a treatment for Ebola, they may be something, many of you could name 101 other things, but where there is some change in the models around which they're developed and then inevitably in the end stockpile, because these then become a national issue. And that, the breakdown of societies in West Africa would affect all of us, and they become national security issues. So I think I don't think, much as many of us would like, to change Big Pharma. I don't think that's where, although it is partially where the problem lies, I don't think the answer lies in just shouting at Big Pharma. We've got to find a better way of incentivising them, whether that be with pre-approvals, agreements to buy whatever it might be, drug resistance or emerging infections, or extended patents, or there's all sorts of imaginative ways we could do that, but we haven't done it. I have to say, in this particular case, the companies with the vaccines, departments of defence around the world, and obviously one in particular, has sat on these vaccines and these drugs for the best part of 5 to 10 years and never taken them through to the critical phase 1 testing to prove they're safe. To me, that's unethical. Is that on camera? If you're going to do that research, that's great, but surely for a disease which you cannot predict and which is inevitably going to come back, you would want to have taken those through to at least demonstrated their safety so that you could then move with them.
Hi, I appreciate your great talk. I have a question which goes back to a statement so do you think we have to work on the relationship between medicine and public health, or let it diverse for long again? Because in countries like you have worked in Vietnam, underdeveloped or developing countries, because there's no public health faculties, so the clinicians are taking the responsibility of public health, and therefore there's a interdisciplinary connection and things are happening much more. If they're really working hard, then it's easy to make things happen. But in some, there is a merit and demerit for it, as well as in countries like UK where there's completely different set of clinicians and public health, there's a merit and demerit for it. So what is the best way to work to go ahead with public health or medicine?
Do you mean as an individual or for the betterment of people?
For the betterment of the people.
Okay. I can only give you a personal view, and that is, and I think it's very interesting to look back at the history, and public health was public health because that was provided out of the public purse. Clinicians like myself were just working in Harley Street or wherever it was on that picture and making money, and there was a separation. I think Jon Snow represents an individual that spanned those two, and I think we desperately need to bring those two back together. I think your comment about lower middle income countries is even more acute, because those are, well, at least in my experience, totally separate, and actually encouraging people, I'm talking now about Vietnam, encouraging people to go into, say, clinical medicine, where it is largely driven by the private sector, there is more money to be made, compared to going into public health, is a real challenge. And if you then talk about veterinary medicine, it's even worse, which is why veterinary medicine around the world is in such dire straits, because there are huge financial incentives to go into clinical medicine and very little incentives to go into public health. So I think by bringing those back together again and offering the same, I don't know how to do this. This is the sort of question back for you at the London School of Hygiene. How do we do this? But I don't think what we're doing at the moment works in any country, including this one.
Yes, please.
I wanted to ask if you could comment on potential interventions that could be taken up by funding agencies or schools such as the London School to address the issues that cause the divorce. You said the London School needs to do this, and the funding bodies need to change it to reduce the 0 to 611 days.
Yeah.
I'm well impressed by Uganda, for instance, and it takes a long time to get a grant proposal into the time that you start recruitment.
Surely not. At some point, somebody is going to mention project and program grants, I assume. I think one of the things which has been well trailed, I've even spoken in this building about it, is an absolute appreciation that the change of, this is now getting on to Welcome Trust Speak, which I should not do because I'm not here. I don't have my braces on or my false moustache. I'm here not as Welcome Trust, but I think the loss through, so this is a sideline from a Welcome Trust Speak, I think the loss of the ability within the Trust to put things together across disciplines in collaborative ventures was an unfortunate decision, and I think in the new year that is going to be changed, such that, of course, we won't call them programme grants because it's just too emotional an issue, but we'll call them something like collaborative grants or team research or whatever it is, to allow better, truly multidisciplinary at the highest level across disciplines. And I hope, particularly in population health, particularly in the social sciences, particularly linking public health and medicine, that there will be great opportunities for putting those two things back together. And I think that's where the Trust can play a role by putting that back on the agenda, encouraging it and make sure it happens. So I hope that will come out soon.
That may be a good note on which to invite Peter to make a few comments. Please.
Thank you, Paul. Well, thank you, Jeremy. It was just fantastic and, close to my heart because I share the same vision. So I've never had any training in epidemiology or in public health, but here I am. And also, just like John Snow in '76, when we investigated the first Ebola epidemic, we came at the right moment for an epidemiologist. When the curve of this, you showed several curves, when the epidemic was already going down, and so we could put that on our credit also. But global health has many definitions, and I wouldn't even try to define it. But for me, what's at the heart of it is that it has broken down the walls between, or is breaking down the walls between public health, population health, clinical medicine, the health sector, non-health sector, and even between, I would say, low, middle, and high-income countries, because we are getting into a total spectrum. We have the third and the fourth world in London. We have high-income islands in low-income countries, Vietnam even today, etc. And so the time where the old paradigm is still alive, but it's dying. And that paradigm was the problems are in the south or in the global south, the solutions are in the north, and this here from London we will tell what's good for the world. And for me the paradigm changed with HIV. There's one emerging infection that's not on your once upon a time this was also an emerging infection, and a zoonotic infection. Let's not forget this comes from chimps. So it's the same story, but it should also be an important lesson for a few reasons. One, this was a virus that infects non-human primates, I mean the chimp, and that adapted to us human primates in some way or another, not that long ago. And look what happened, how it spread over the world. And for me, one of the main lessons of the AIM response, or the three lessons, is that pure prevention without offering something to people who are affected and infected, in other words, treatment, has hardly any credibility beyond a few weeks' time. And so that's, I think, was for the first time since a long time that schism between the clinical medicine and public health was broken down. It took a long time, and I remember I came here in the 80s trying to convince the school to work on AIDS, and the response said, "It's not a tropical disease. Why should we deal with this?" And plus it had to do with sex. So, but this was, I think, one of the really very important lessons, and that's one of the reasons I'm also so keen that even with very acute epidemics, like Ebola now, that we make sure that this is the last outbreak of Ebola where all we have is isolation and quarantine, and not, as you've said also, Jeremy, stockpiles of therapy, vaccines, based in the affected countries. Because there will be more epidemics, because there is an animal reservoir, and unless it becomes even endemic. Second lesson from AIDS is that, you know, medicine alone cannot solve this, or the medical approach. You really need to take care of a lot of things, and that goes from you know, from accelerated discovery and innovation, and I think also here AIDS was a pioneer, because the 600 etc. days were sometimes reduced to less than a couple of months. So it means that it's possible. Nothing unethical happened, or to my knowledge, maybe a little bit, but not much. No, but I mean not intentionally. And the result was that you know, more lives were saved, and that's what it's all about. So this is something that I'm not saying that, you know, it is the example to follow. There have been many problems also, but it just announced a new era in health. And global health as a term only popped up in the late 90s. It's very hard to find when exactly was it used for the first time. And I think it's linked to our globalized world, to the changes, the mobility that you talked about, but also the greater integration of, you know, spread of knowledge and all this. So you put a challenge to us also as a school. I like that. We need to make sure that we prepare now for the future, and that 20 years from now we're still not only relevant but cutting edge. And so that's one of our responsibilities. I'm very proud of the multiple disciplines that are working more or less together in our institution, but I think it could be better. Than not enough synergies, not always respect for other, you know, types of discipline, and then there's a major challenge that we're faced with, and that is that we are often encouraged to submit multidisciplinary proposals, and then they end up in the hands of a monodisciplinary committee. And you know, and that's, I think, something where I put that challenge to the trust and to others to do something about it, because it has to be on sides, and it's not easy. So thanks so much. It was wonderful to have you here. I promise you will get more invitations than you know, within the next 5 years at least. One, and I think I've learned a lot, and made me think a lot, and so thanks again for coming. Thank you. Don't forget your work.
Okay, we're most grateful, but you do have one more duty. You have to take the handle off the pump for one more time. Sorry? I always get it wrong.
Oh, it's here.
Oh, right, thank you.
I don't know where it is.
Yeah, it's really simple.
Paul, where is it?
Yes, this is right. Can I just say I trained in surgery, orthopedics. I'm really expert at pumps. Yeah.
It hasn't come out, Paul.
Okay, can we have a picture of that? You're right. Hooray! And in grateful thanks, we are making you an honorary member of the Society. A huge privilege. Better than a passport in many countries of the world. Also, one of our mugs, a beautiful tie, and for the rest of you, you can have the earrings if you really insist. Anyway, we are now going to, our speakers very, very kindly agreed to go down to the pub with us, and we hope that many of you will join us there. If you don't know where it is, a crowd will gather in the foyer and do the fairly short walk down to the pub. And I'd just like to say a few personal words too. This is my last AGM as the Honorary Secretary. And can I just say, when I first had the idea for the Society 25 years ago, I had no idea I'd still be the Secretary, let you be warned. I am extremely lucky that some very, very able colleagues agreed it was an idea and that we were able to set it up and found it and have worked on it all these years. And we are so grateful to you, the members. I mean, we don't do an awful lot as the Society, but as a network, we are unique, the one and only. Please come down to the pub and celebrate with our very good speaker and with other members. Thank you.
Thank you very much.